Welcome to Probability and Statistics. This is the first video of many that you're going to watch this semester. Previously in class, we've talked about the big picture idea for what we're going to do this semester. We want to study some populations, we need to collect some data, we need to analyze that data, and then hopefully through probability we can make inferences about our population. So let's start with collecting data. There's multiple different types of data that we're going to collect, and we need to know the difference between them. And so the two main types of data that we deal with are categorical data and quantitative data. You can also refer to categorical data as qualitative data, but for your benefit as well as mine, rather than try to keep quantitative and qualitative separate, we're going to stick with categorical and quantitative. So let's start with categorical data. Categorical data comes from trying to organize or describe attributes of our population. So whenever we're collecting data, we have to decide what variable or variables we want to study, what we want to collect. So if we're studying students at KWC, a variable could be how many credit hours are they taking. If we're studying African rhinos, a variable could be the weight of that rhino. So a variable just refers to a specific quantity or property of whatever we're studying as far as our population. So categorical data is just trying to organize or describe that. If we are working with non-numerical data, that's always going to be categorical data. Unfortunately, just because something is numerical data does not mean that it's going to be quantitative. So categorical is organizing or describing something about our population. Quantitative data is whenever we seek to either count or measure something. So whether we're counting the number of days that we go to class, or if we're measuring the amount of time that we spend studying, we're going to get numerical data for that. So quantitative data is always numerical, and it comes from either counts or measurements. So quantitative data comes in two different types. We have discrete quantitative data or continuous quantitative data. So discrete data is data that only comes in certain values. A lot of times this will be whole number values, and discrete data generally comes from a situation where we're counting. If we're counting something, we generally don't count fractions or decimals or irrational numbers. We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? We have very specific sets of values that are allowable. Continuous data generally comes from a measurement. If we're measuring the length or weight or volume or something like that, that doesn't happen in fixed size steps. We can have decimals and fractions and irrational numbers, and so that is what's called continuous quantitative data or discrete quantitative data. And so one of the other ways that we can talk about, or we can determine whether or not we're working with quantitative data or categorical data, is by asking ourselves the question, does the average make sense? Now, we haven't actually talked about an average yet, And so maybe this will make more sense later. But you should have seen an average, or you should be familiar with an average from day-to-day life. And so whenever we ask that question, we look at the data that we're looking at, and we ask, does the average make sense? And if the average does make sense, then that's quantitative data. If I'm talking about average length of a class, or if I'm talking about average weight of a dog, right, those are quantities that make sense. However, let's look at something like zip code, right? If we're polling people, let's say in Kentucky, and we ask them to fill out their zip code, zip codes are technically made out of numbers, right? But if we were to ask a question like, what is the average zip code of a person in Kentucky, and say, well, let's add up all the zip codes and divide by however many people there are, the number that comes out of that does not make sense. So a zip code is an example of a situation where we have data that contains numbers, but it's still categorical data. It's still describing an area of Kentucky or the United States that a person lives, and it is not counting or measuring anything about those people. So this is a brief introduction to categorical and quantitative data. It's important to get these concepts down because these are going to come up a lot throughout the semester.